Derek Campbell was a street artist born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio. To some, he was a vandal. To others, a visionary. He didn't care about labels. What mattered was the feeling of freedom when holding a spray can and transforming forgotten surfaces into works of art. In recent months, Derek had developed a habit of exploring abandoned train lines on the city's outskirts, remote places where his art wouldn't be easily erased or contested by other graffiti artists. On a warm summer night, he convinced his best friend, Jason, to join him on a trip to an old train line outside the city. Jason, though not an artist, enjoyed smoking and listening to music while Derek worked. The two were inseparable, and Derek appreciated the company, especially in such isolated spots. "This place is perfect, man," Derek said, admiring a long line of rusted train cars. "No one's going to show up to mess with my vibe." Jason took a drag from his cigarette, distractedly watching as Derek pulled spray cans from his backpack. They were in a remote area surrounded by dense brush with no light except for the moon. The sounds of the city felt like a distant echo. Derek began working on his first piece, an abstract mural with vibrant colors that contrasted against the corroded metal of the train cars. Each movement of his hand was precise, almost choreographed. Jason leaned against a nearby tree, rolling another cigarette and watching his friend. "Don't you ever get paranoid about someone showing up here?" Jason asked, breaking the silence. "Not really. It's pretty rare to run into anyone in places like this," Derek replied, his eyes still focused on his work. "And if they do, we'll just bail. Easy." Not long after finishing the second piece, something broke the stillness of the night. A metallic noise echoed along the tracks, like something had fallen or been kicked. The two friends froze, exchanging alert glances. "You hear that?" Jason asked, quickly snubbing out his cigarette. "Probably just an animal," Derek said, trying to sound confident. "These places always have raccoons or something." Even so, he worked faster, moving to the next train car with a growing sense of unease. Jason stood still, scanning the darkness for any signs of movement. Minutes later, another noise, this time louder and closer. Derek stopped painting, his heart racing. Jason shot to his feet, his eyes wide. "That wasn't an animal, Derek." Before they could argue, a spray can, one Derek had discarded, rolled out of the darkness and stopped near them. The metallic clatter sent a cold wave of dread through both of them. Someone was out there. "Who's there?" Jason shouted, trying to sound intimidating. The only response was silence, thick and oppressive. Derek dropped his spray can and moved closer to Jason. The two began backing away slowly, their eyes fixed on the direction the can had come from. Then came something even more unnerving. Footsteps. Not hurried, but deliberate, accompanied by a raspy voice echoing between the train cars. "You think you can just come here and do whatever you want?" the voice said. Panic set in. Derek and Jason turned and ran down the tracks in the opposite direction. The footsteps behind them quickened, now accompanied by shouts that pierced the night. "You're not getting away!" the voice roared. Suddenly, a deafening crack split the air, the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. Jason stumbled, nearly falling, but Derek grabbed his arm and pulled him forward. They ran harder than ever, their footsteps mixing with their ragged breaths. When they finally reached the nearby road, they turned back but saw no one. The figure had vanished into the darkness. Without hesitation, they jumped into their car and sped off, the silence between them as heavy as the fear gripping them. Derek glanced in the rearview mirror, his adrenaline still surging. "What the hell was that? Who was that guy?" Jason asked, his voice shaking. "I have no idea, but something tells me he wasn't just trying to scare us." And with that, what had started as a night of fun and art had turned into a nightmare they would never forget. Derek couldn't get that terrifying night out of his head. The sound of the gunshot, the man's screams, and the chase along the tracks hammered his mind like a constant nightmare. Jason was shaken too, but the two had agreed not to tell anyone about what had happened. Still, something deep inside Derek wouldn't let it go. He felt compelled to return to that place, to understand what had happened, and maybe confront his own fears. It took 2 weeks for him to summon the courage to go back. This time he would go during the day, alone, and with something for protection. He tucked a folding knife into his backpack and left early, leaving a message for Jason. I'm heading to the tracks. I need to figure out what happened. If I don't reply by 2 p.m., call me." The sun was bright when Derek arrived. In the daylight, the scene looked harmless. The rusted train cars, overgrown weeds, and absolute silence. It didn't seem like the same place that had turned into a nightmare just days before. He began walking along the tracks, passing the faded marks of his graffiti tags. But when he reached the spot where he had first heard the sound that night, something caught his attention. The ground was littered with small shards of glass, as if a bottle had been smashed there recently. He crouched down to inspect them and noticed something even stranger. Fresh paint marks on the ground. They weren't his, and the vibrant red looked intentionally smeared. Derek continued walking cautiously, his stomach churning. Farther ahead, he noticed what looked like an open door on one of the train cars. It wasn't something he had seen before. Perhaps it had been closed during his last visit. The first thing that hit him as he approached was the smell. A strong chemical odor, almost suffocating, like a mix of paint and cleaning agents. He climbed up carefully, the wooden planks of the car creaking under his weight. At the center of the empty space was a chair, a simple wooden chair, but its isolated position in the middle of the car felt deeply unsettling. Around it were chains and ropes, some attached to the chair's legs, others strewn across the floor. A chill ran down Derek's spine. He took out his phone to snap a photo, but hesitated. It felt like he was invading a place he shouldn't be. That's when he heard it again. The metallic sound, like something being kicked or thrown. His heart pounded. "Is someone there?" he called out, his voice steadier than he felt. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any response. Suddenly, footsteps echoed outside the train car. Derek froze. He could feel the weight of the knife in his backpack, but he knew it wouldn't be enough if the man from that night had returned. He ducked behind a stack of old crates in the corner of the car, holding his breath. The footsteps grew closer, slow and deliberate, until they stopped right at the entrance of the car. Derek couldn't see anything except the shadow of a figure blocking the sunlight. "I knew you'd come back," a familiar, gravelly voice said. It was him. Panic surged through Derek, but his mind raced with alertness. He needed to get out, fast. He scanned the area for an escape route. The only option was the opposite door of the train car, but it meant running right past the man. Before he could plan his move, the man stepped into the car. The chemical smell intensified, and Derek saw he was holding a cylindrical metallic object. He couldn't tell what it was, but he didn't want to find out. Summoning every ounce of courage, Derek grabbed one of the chains from the floor and hurled it toward the man. The movement was instinctive, but enough to create a distraction. The chain clattered loudly, and the man stepped back in surprise. Derek bolted. He leapt through the opposite door of the train car, nearly twisting his ankle as he landed on the tracks. Without looking back, he ran as fast as his legs would carry him, the sound of his pounding footsteps drowning out everything else. When he finally reached his car, he threw open the door and jumped in, locking it immediately. His hands shook as he started the engine. Glancing in the rearview mirror, he saw the figure standing far off, watching him. Even from a distance, he could feel the weight of that gaze. As he drove away, something Jason had said before echoed in his mind. "Don't you ever get paranoid about someone showing up?" That night, after recounting everything to Jason, they agreed never to return to that place. But even months later, Derek still had nightmares. He knew there was something more to those tracks, something he could never fully understand. And most disturbing of all, he knew the man wasn't done with him. I've never been one to back down from a challenge. Since I was young, I've always sought new and thrilling experiences, especially those that came with a rush of adrenaline. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what I encountered in that train tunnel on a hot summer afternoon in rural Kansas. It was my last day visiting the town where I grew up. I didn't come back often, but whenever I did, I found myself revisiting the places that had once been the stage for my youthful adventures. That day, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years: hop a ride on a freight train. The tracks ran through a landscape of golden wheat fields and dense forests, with a stone tunnel midway that I had always found fascinating. The plan was simple. I'd wait for the next train, hop onto one of the cars, and jump off after the tunnel, near the small bridge crossing the local river. I parked my car in a secluded spot and walked to the tracks. It didn't take long to feel the metallic vibration beneath my feet and see the train appearing on the horizon. I hid behind some trees until the train came closer. As it passed, I started running alongside it, searching for an easy car to climb. It wasn't my first time doing this, so within seconds, I grabbed hold of a side ladder and pulled myself up. As the train sped along, I felt the wind on my face and the rush of adrenaline surging through me. The tunnel loomed ahead, and I braced for the part I had always considered the most exhilarating, the transition from daylight to complete darkness. When the train entered the tunnel, the world seemed to stop. The sound of the wheels on the tracks became deafening, and everything around me was swallowed by pitch-black darkness. The only sounds were the constant rumble of the train and my own breathing. Then it happened. Out of nowhere, I felt something touch my leg. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the result of being on edge. But before I could react, something grabbed my ankle with a firm grip. My heart raced, and the adrenaline was replaced by paralyzing fear. Instinctively, I kicked to free myself, but whatever, or whoever, was there didn't let go. All I could do was cling tighter to the train and try to climb a few more rungs on the ladder, desperate to escape. As the train emerged from the tunnel and sunlight flooded the scene, I looked down but saw no one. Nothing. Just the tracks disappearing into the darkness of the tunnel behind me. The sensation of that grip was still vivid on my skin, as though it had only just happened. I decided to jump off the train as soon as it slowed down on a curve near the bridge. My legs were trembling as I walked along the tracks, heading back to the tunnel. I didn't know what to expect, but I had to understand what had happened. When I reached the entrance to the tunnel, I hesitated. The darkness seemed more impenetrable than before, and every instinct screamed at me to turn around, but curiosity pushed me forward. I entered cautiously, illuminating the path with my phone's flashlight. Everything seemed calm until I noticed something on the ground. It was an old leather glove, worn and marked with scuffs. Next to it, I saw something even more disturbing, scratch marks on the tunnel wall, as if someone had desperately tried to hold on there. That was enough for me. I bolted out of the tunnel, leaving it and whatever was inside behind. I returned to my car, but the feeling that something or someone was still there lingered. Little did I know that was only the beginning of my nightmare. After that terrifying experience in the tunnel, I couldn't sleep. The scratch marks, the old leather glove, and most of all the feeling of something grabbing my leg played over and over in my mind like a bad movie. Something wasn't right. I needed answers, even if it meant going back to the place that had haunted me. The next morning, I decided to face it head on. I grabbed a stronger flashlight, a hunting knife my father had kept in the house, and an old portable radio to feel less vulnerable. I didn't tell anyone what I planned to do. Part of me knew that anyone sensible would call me crazy. When I arrived at the tunnel, the same sense of unease swept over me. The wind felt colder and the silence was oppressive. Every step toward the tunnel's entrance felt heavier, but I pressed on. Inside, the darkness seemed to swallow me whole. The flashlight's beam illuminated damp walls and rusted tracks. I scanned my surroundings, searching for any sign of what might have grabbed me the previous night. At first, everything seemed still. I walked about 30 meters into the tunnel when I heard a sound. A low, repetitive clicking noise echoed from further ahead. My breathing quickened, but I kept moving, gripping the flashlight tightly in one hand and the knife in the other. More marks began to appear on the walls, deep, jagged scratches as if someone had clawed at the stone with desperation and force. A chill ran down my spine, but I felt I was close to uncovering the truth. I reached the spot where I'd found the glove the day before. To my surprise, it was gone. The ground was empty, but faint footprints in the dust were visible. Fresh ones. Then I heard the sound that made my heart stop. A low moan, almost human but distorted, like it was mixed with a muffled roar. My flashlight shook in my hand as I searched for the source. That's when I saw movement in the darkness. It was a low silhouette moving erratically. It looked human, but something was off. The figure was hunched over, its arms unnaturally long and disproportionate. When the flashlight beam caught its face, I saw something I'll never forget. It was a grotesque mixture of human flesh and scars, as though it had endured unimaginable torture. The creature let out a piercing, pained scream before charging toward me. Panic overtook me, and I did the only thing I could. I ran. My feet barely touched the ground as I fled the tunnel, the creature's screams echoing behind me. The daylight felt miles away, but I finally reached the exit. I instinctively turned to look back, but the creature stopped at the edge of the darkness, as if it couldn't leave. Its eyes, glowing faintly pale, followed me until I disappeared from view. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I couldn't believe what I had seen, but I knew it was real. I drove home in silence, my mind racing to make sense of it all. Later, I did some research and discovered that decades ago, the tunnel had been used to transport prisoners. Many had mysteriously disappeared, and some stories spoke of cruel experiments conducted in secret. Could what I saw be a remnant of that dark past? I haven't returned to the tunnel since. The experience left me shaken in ways I never imagined. At night, I still hear that creature's scream in my nightmares. Some truths I've learned are better left undiscovered. Sometimes it's best to leave the past buried in the dark. My name is Nathaniel Reed, and although I've worked as a New York City subway maintenance worker for nearly 7 years, there's one night that stands out among all the others. What happened during that shift is burned into my memory as a dark, unshakable reminder of something I still can't fully explain. It was an ordinary night, typical of a city that never sleeps, but the eerie silence hanging over High Street Station was unusual. The distant rumble of passing trains and the hum of fluorescent lights were the only sounds keeping me company as I went about cleaning the platform. The station was completely deserted, which, while strange, was also a small relief. Working without the constant bustle of passengers had its perks. As I pushed my mop across the floor, I heard a sound that stopped me in my tracks. A metallic clang echoed from deep within the tunnel like a stone falling onto the tracks. The noise was so unexpected that I dropped the mop, its handle clattering to the floor. My heart raced for a moment, but I convinced myself it was probably just an animal or a chunk of concrete loosening from the aging tunnel ceiling. Odd sounds weren't unusual in the city's aging subway system. But no matter how much I tried to dismiss it, the sound lingered in my mind, and a growing sense of unease began to take root. I resumed my work, trying to shake it off. Then, about 10 minutes later, it happened again. The same metallic clang, this time much louder and closer. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I set my tools aside and walked to the edge of the platform, peering into the tunnel. The darkness stretched endlessly, like a gaping mouth waiting to swallow anyone foolish enough to venture in. Grabbing my flashlight, I pointed its beam into the abyss, searching for anything that might explain the noise. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice echoing against the concrete walls. For a moment, there was no response, just an oppressive silence that seemed to choke the air around me. But then, I heard something that made me step back instinctively, a faint, childlike voice, almost a whisper, calling for help. "Please, help me." My blood ran cold. Who would leave a child alone in a place like this? It made no sense, but the urgency in the voice was impossible to ignore. "Where are you?" I shouted, trying to steady my nerves. "Here, further ahead." "I'm hurt," the voice replied, a bit clearer now. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong. But how could I ignore a child asking for help? Carefully stepping onto the tracks, I began making my way into the tunnel, my flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. The beam illuminated the tracks and walls, but nothing else. Just an overwhelming void. "Keep talking so I can find you," I shouted. "I'm here, right in front of you," the voice said, now clearer than ever. Pointing my flashlight ahead, I saw what appeared to be the silhouette of a boy. He was crouched on the tracks, his head down as if in pain. But something wasn't right. The light from my flashlight seemed to pass through parts of him, as though he wasn't entirely solid. Before I could fully process what I was seeing, I noticed something else. Behind him, a tall, dark figure began to take shape. Humanoid, but unnaturally large and shrouded in shadow, It seemed to materialize from the tunnel itself. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was frozen in place. The boy lifted his head, and with a voice that was now cold and hollow, he said, "You're not supposed to be here." The figure behind him stepped forward, and that was all I needed to see. I turned and bolted back toward the platform, my heart pounding as the sound of my frantic footsteps echoed off the tunnel walls. I leaped onto the platform in a single motion and spun around to look back into the tunnel. Nothing. No voices, no figures. Just the pounding of my heart in my chest and the undeniable feeling that something deeply wrong had just unfolded. I stayed on the platform for a while, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the entire encounter. But then, something on the ground caught my eye. A small child's sneaker, dusty and smeared with grease, lying abandoned near the edge of the tracks. The image of the abandoned sneaker lingered in my mind as I stood frozen on the empty platform. Every fiber of my being urged me to leave, but something stronger, a mix of morbid curiosity and a sense of responsibility, kept me rooted in place. After a few minutes of deliberation, I made a decision. I grabbed the radio on my belt and called Central Dispatch. "Central, this is Nathaniel. I'm at High Street Station. I need immediate support. I think I saw something in the tunnel." There was a brief pause before the operator responded, their voice calm but clearly puzzled. "Something? Can you be more specific?" "I can't say for sure. I heard a voice. It sounded like a child, but there's something strange going on. It's urgent." Central assured me that a team would be dispatched to investigate, but I knew it would take at least 20 minutes for them to arrive. At that moment, I had a choice: wait or go back and investigate. Against my better judgment, I picked up my flashlight and stepped onto the tracks once again. The tunnel ahead seemed darker and quieter than before, almost as if it were watching me. The memory of the child's voice and the towering, menacing figure I'd seen earlier made me hesitate, but the pull to uncover the truth was too strong to resist. I started walking, each step echoing against the concrete walls. The silence was suffocating and the darkness seemed to close in around me. A few meters ahead, I noticed a faint glint on the ground. When I got closer, I saw it was a small metal toy, a miniature truck. I picked it up, feeling the cold weight of the metal in my hands. It looked freshly polished, with no dust or signs of wear. Then I heard it again. "You came back." The voice echoed around me, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Frantically, I swung my flashlight in every direction, searching for the source. Once again, the boy's silhouette appeared, this time closer. His eyes, deep and hollow, reflected the light like mirrors. "Who are you? What's happening here?" I asked, my voice shaking more than I'd hoped. The boy didn't respond immediately. Instead, he raised a hand and pointed behind me. My body froze, paralyzed by fear, before I summoned the courage to turn around. The tall, shadowy figure was there again, now fully visible. I directed the flashlight toward it, but the light seemed to be swallowed by the darkness that surrounded it. Its face was an indistinct mask of shadows, terrifying in its vagueness. Before I could react, it stepped forward, and the boy's voice whispered, "He doesn't like intruders." Panic surged through me as I began to back away, stumbling over the tracks. The figure extended a long, skeletal arm, reaching toward me. Then the tunnel was filled with an ear-splitting sound, a high-pitched, grotesque scream, something no human could make. I ran. I didn't look back. Each step felt heavier than the last, but I pushed through, ignoring the burn in my lungs and the ache in my legs. When I finally saw the faint light of the platform ahead, relief flooded over me. I scrambled back up and turned to look at the tunnel one last time. For a moment, everything was still. The silence returned, oppressive as before. But then the darkness in the tunnel began to pulse, as if it were alive, and the scream I'd heard earlier echoed once more, shaking the walls of the subway. At that moment, the security team arrived. 3 men descended with flashlights and radios, asking what had happened. I could barely speak, pointing toward the tunnel and trying to explain what I had seen. They exchanged skeptical glances but decided to investigate. As I waited on the platform, their radios crackled with static, and nervous voices filtered through the air. Minutes later, the men re-emerged, pale and visibly shaken. They said they hadn't found anyone in the tunnel, but admitted they had felt something wrong. Since that night, I've avoided High Street Station at all costs. Whenever I pass by, I feel as though something is watching me. I don't know what I encountered in that tunnel, or who. But one thing is certain, I'm never going back to find out.